Thank you all for joining us today. We are going to speak in this session about community college budgeting and financial management. We have an intro slide in just a moment. So first and foremost, objectives for today's presentation. We want to make sure that we identify the three primary components of community college finance. Okay, those are going to be foundational to you as you're building out your budget. Understanding the nuances of the funding now that we have what is lovingly referred to as House Bill 8 in effect. And then make sure that we're comparing and contrasting some of the budgetary management practices that you may be experiencing at your institution or seeing at your institution based on the new dynamic funding model. So to give you a quick intro, my name is Amanda Allen. I am president of Wharton County Junior College, president effective September 1. Prior to that, I was executive vice president at the institution for about 7 years. I spent a good amount of that time when House Bill 8 first came out as the data person for our institution, really delving into what all made up the various components of House Bill 8. And so we'll look at a little bit of that today.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Nothing like having the finance at the very end of the day. So we know that we'll try to keep this engaging and interesting and welcome your questions at the end. And if there's something that you want us to spend more time on, but we want to make sure we go through the key objectives. As Amanda said, I am Christy Vian. I currently serve as the Vice Chancellor for Finance and Administration and the CFO for Lone Star College System. So we will go ahead and dive right in.
All right, so with regard to community college finance, you have three main buckets. We oftentimes refer to these as levers, right? So you push one, pull one to get to your ultimate overarching budget. So of course we have local taxes. Okay, those are paid in by your tax base. You have tuition and fees, of course, paid to us by our students. And then the state appropriations, so the monies that we do get from the state that the coordinating board helps make the rules for. And again, which has changed dramatically over the past 3 years due to implementation of House Bill 8 and making sure that we're really gearing those state appropriations towards performance funding. So just to give you an overview, this is community college finance at a glance. So if we look at this, there will be a test. So, okay, make sure you're memorizing, real fast. No. So if we look at the bars, we've got the dark blue on the bottom is the net tuition and fees. Okay, so again, tuition and fees paid by our students. In the middle, that light blue is our state appropriations, and then red is local support. So you'll see every single community college on here has a completely different composition that makes up their overall revenue that comes into that institution. Okay, so when we're talking about community college finance, remember this, not in terms of who's where on the spectrum, but just that, yes, we're going to speak to some strategies. Yes, we're going to speak to how these things might impact your institution, but one institution to another is going to be impacted greatly in a greatly different way based on your overall composition of your local support, your state appropriations, and what your students are paying to you in student funds. So as you're listening to strategies, remember, always at the end of the day, go back to listen to your CEO and your CFO about how these are impacting your specific institution and how you need to respond to fluctuations in any one of these three buckets.
So as you indicated, a lot of times, and I know we've got trustees in the room, we've got varying degrees of experience. And so when we talk about local property taxes, it is just that. It's an idea. It is the biggest portion of the budget for many colleges. It is the smallest percentage of the budget for others, right? So the variation across the 50 community colleges across the state can vary tremendously depending on the tax base. So I say that when we talk about strategies, when we talk about things, you really do have to keep in mind that this is an overarching, but what works for one institution may not work for others. So when you're looking at these items and you're thinking about questions, they're not necessarily comparing you against one another, but at least just helping you understand that these three sources ultimately make up the budget for that particular year. So when we talk about the taxing district and the service area, we'll get into that, and we talk about maintenance and operations, because your taxing district for those are those entities that actually pay into into the bucket, if you will. But many of us actually have service areas that we service as part of our ISDs or articulation agreements, but they are not actually paying taxes into the product. So it's one of those things to consider when you talk about taxing versus service area. And again, that can vary greatly. When you talk about the two components of the property taxes, I always like to refer to as buckets, because when we talk about maintenance and operation, that is our operating fund, right? That is the portion of taxes that you can pay salaries, you can buy things, right? You can buy paper. When I'm talking to faculty, when I'm talking to individuals, they're like, well, why can't you just use the other piece? Why can't you use the INS piece? And so I always have to explain that the pieces of the buckets don't touch, right? You cannot take money from one bucket and put it in the other bucket and vice versa. Sometimes I take that for granted when we're doing things. So when I'm doing budget cycle and getting through, have to really stress that to our constituents, to our students, to our faculty, to our new administrators, to make sure that when they see the overall operating budget and when they look at these numbers, that they understand that the two are always separate. So this just gives you an idea that when you're looking at your total tax rate, your M&O and your INS should total your total tax rate for FY25. Now, I don't know about you, but the taxes and talking about taxes this legislative session has been a little bit of whiplash in trying to understand what would impact us, what would not impact us. So when we're talking about the taxing rate, that's something for you to definitely consider, right? And how that impacts your taxing rate. Even several of the community colleges that I visited with recently have had to also budget and be prepared for not only total tax rate that they're getting, but how many exemptions are coming in, how many applications of people who are contesting their property taxes are coming in. And for quite a few of you, that is actually becoming more and more of an impact of the budget, right? So we're going to continue to see taxes be a big part of the equation. And again, for some colleges, it's $1 million of the budget. For some, it's, $225, $250 million of the budget. So it really can vary depending on the specific area in the state that you are in. So when you're talking about the second part of the income is your tuition and fees. And as many of you know, the tuition and fees is probably the piece of the budget. Yes, the board adopts the tax rate, but the board also adopts the tuition and fee rate, right? And so that's probably something that you all spend a great deal of time, as much as you do talking about the taxes, on the tuition and fees. And she, as Amanda showed you on the slide on there, it really varies, right, in terms of what you're in district, what you're out of district, and what you're out of state or international fees should be. So again, basing your rate is really looking at equalizing where you need to be as part of the budget. But it is a delicate dance, right? Because we don't want to outpace ourselves out of the market, right? We don't want to outpace make it where our most vulnerable students aren't able to pay tuition and fees. So it is something that we have to be very intentional. As you are probably aware, this is an item that has also been a lot of discussion with the tuition and fees being frozen for the last two administrative cycles. So that is something that we're also looking at. And so for many community college, that has been part of a difficult conversation, because while we're working on managing tax rate, we're managing tuition fees and state appropriations. So it really is a delicate time in budget preparation when you're trying to manage all three of those equations being in an influx at one time. As many of the years as I've been in finance, normally you have one of them in flux. Right? This year, it seems like it's been a year that they're all in flux for one reason or the other, whether it legislatively or otherwise. So just something to take in mind, that it is, and this is typically part of the year that we're starting to look at tuition and fees and things like that. But again, they remain frozen at this time. But it is part of the piece that the board sets. And we also look at what the in-district, out-of-district, and out-of-state piece is. We look at tuition versus fees. How many of you have a flat model where you don't charge any or all your fees are built in? Okay. How many of you have separate tuition and fees? How many of you are not quite sure? And it's okay. Yeah, that's fair. I know many of you are just getting started, right? So that's something to look at as well, because many of the community colleges may have what we call a flat tuition, meaning any fees, whether it be a lab fee, a textbook fee, any of those type of things would be rolled into the overall tuition. There's pros and cons to that. A lot of times that you want your fees rolled into your tuition because there's sometimes where you'll have different agencies that won't pay third-party fees, where they'll be able to have their tuition paid for, but not their lab fee or their class fee or their online fee or, all the various fees that we might have. So for a lot of different reasons, you might see fees built out on a particular student AR statement, either separate or together. So when you're talking with your colleagues, when you're comparing yourself across the state, that's something to keep in mind. Also, when you're looking at tax or when you're looking at tuition rates, that's something to also consider is does the rate actually have fees included or is it broken out separately? And again, we could have a whole complete conversation about pros and cons of that, but I did want to make sure to at least highlight that distinction for you because that does play a big part. And then we also have waivers and exemptions. I know every time I put together a P&L statement, especially this time of year, waivers is a big piece on our P&L statement because it actually shows what we waive for dual credit, what we waive for Hazelwood, what we waive for paramedics and firefighters. There's quite a few different waivers, but those are some of the most activated ones, if you will. And so when we talk about dual credit, when we talk about those sort of things, for most of us, we actually waive tuition and fees, and then you may actually have a separate fee that you charge for dual credit. And for us, that comes apart as a waiver. So we waive the actual tuition and fee for dual credit. And so in our P&L statement, it shows a pretty significant dollar figure there for that impact. So something to consider. And when we talk about the various Hazelwood and those other items, those are typically what we call non-funded, legislative items, if you will. So we typically are just writing that off. That is not actually money we receive back from the state. When I'm talking to constituents, when I'm talking to folks, sometimes that is something that people are not aware of. So it's just something for you to be aware of is that a lot of times when we're waiving something, it is not necessarily something that we're receiving tuition or fees back from a third-party agency. And like I said, Hazelwood and a couple of the others are pretty significant for us, at least. So kind of going back, this is the reason I mentioned is understanding what factors go in to tuition and fees and whether that's included in there. And so the idea here with the chart is, again, not to, as Amanda said, not to look and memorize or compare yourself necessarily with others, but just to give you an idea of, as a entity, and this information actually came from the tax survey last of February 2025. So that was the last updated information, typically updates in the spring of every year. So this just shows you where the state median is for in-district rates for tuition and fees. So it's around $1,250 approximately, give or take, where the state median is compared to all the rest of, or kind of when you're looking at it across the board. When you look at out of district, right? A lot of strategies go in. Many community college wants their in-district and their out-of-district to be very close together based off of who they're working with or ISD partners or recruitment. And others, they want to intentionally have a value for the taxpayers, right? They intentionally want in-district and out-of-district to be different because they want their taxpayers to feel that it is a benefit for them living in the district, right? Again, pros and cons, not here to tell you one's better or not, but just trying to highlight items that may come up when you're talking to constituents, when you're talking to folks in the district. A lot of times, again, there are rhyme and reason and a lot of strategies that go into that. So I do point out, though, that many of the colleges do intentionally keep out of district and out of state intentionally higher than in district for that reason. Because again, as a taxpayer, I want to know when I get that tax bill in, right, where my money's going, and that that there's a value and that someone potentially living out of district may not get that same rate, but there's a lot of philosophies why that may not be the best thing for your particular college or system. So, right, again, there's a lot of reasons and a lot of variety. So, again, looking at out-of-state and international rates as well, you can see where the state median is right at about the $2,500. Still, if you're asking anybody, still a bargain at any day of the week compared to other colleges and universities throughout the state. So I definitely still think that community colleges are a bargain even for our out-of-district or out-of-state or international students. So again, for $2,500 at the state level, that is still about $18,000 less than what you might see for a lot of the colleges and universities across the state.
Yeah, and I think that idea of, as you're talking to your constituents, is really important for that in-district tuition. So, at the four-year institutions, right, they have just in-state, out-of-state, right? So then community college, for us, one of the big talking points I use when I'm out in the community is so we have in-state and out-of-state, basically, same thing, kind of. But when you're in the tax space, because you pay taxes into the institution, we have an even reduced rate for you, which is that in-district rate, right? And so it's all about really making sure that the community is clear about your narrative, okay? It is a reduced rate below even just our traditional in-state tuition that you get as a member of the tax base. So just something to kind of swing it, because a lot of times people just talk about in-district and then, oh, it's higher for out-of-district. No. Just flip that around. Flip that narrative. Make sure they understand the value that they're getting. They're getting that reduced rate because they're in your tax district. So state appropriations. Okay. So this is that third bucket. And there is a lot to delve into with the state appropriations, but we're going to try and keep it on a level that makes sense. So we've got three tiers, technically two now, but three tiers that we'll talk about very briefly. Base tier, so that is the base level funding for institutions to make sure that you can manage your operations. We've got a performance tier. This is the majority. 95% of state funds have to go into this performance tier. Okay, and that is all based on, are you producing students who are credentialed, who are transferring, who are completing certain outcomes? And then we had, for the first 2 years, a bucket called transition funding. Okay, this was funding for those institutions that, when their base tier and performance tier were calculated, were actually going to fall below what they had previously received from the state the prior fiscal year. They were given transition funding to at least let them stay level. Okay, so we could have a little time to kind of figure this out, get on even playing keel. But that transition funding with this most recent biennium is no longer in effect. Okay, so state appropriations, previous model, you'll see up here, it was all based on enrollment. Okay, so booties and seats was going to get you money, right? Okay, but we've got to do better than just having people in a classroom, okay? So the state has literally put their money where their mouth is and said, okay, the new model, we are going to make sure that we are funding you based on your student outcomes, based on performance, making sure that it is not enough for a student to come and sit in your classroom for 5 years, 6 years, swirl around, maybe go to another. No, they need to finish a credential, and then we will give you funding for that student, okay? So really important shift here, and honestly, it is central to the mission of community colleges. We are not here to let a student kind of swirl around and sit there and just, whatever. No, we are here to be economic drivers within our communities. We need to make sure we are getting students credentials so they can go into the workforce and make a living wage. So this funding model is directly in line with what our mission has been the whole time, right? So if we look at the legacy funding model, we see contact hours, again, how many hours our students were taking. There was some core operations thrown in there. And then it's even a littler triangle. We did have a little portion of the funding model in community colleges already that were based on success points. Some of them are what we still have in our new performance tier funding. Some of them were different, but there was a little portion of that. And one important thing with that to note is that, okay, the success point portion of the funding was a pie. And then all of us just divvied up a portion of that pie, right? And so that pie was set. The state has been very good, we'll talk about, with performance funding, as we have increased our performance, meeting us with that increase. So we're not all fighting over the same pie. If we are improving our outcomes, then the state has backed us up on that. Oh, sorry. So then now we flip that on its head, right? There is a base tier component. There is a consideration for making sure that you can meet your core operations. But again, the bulk is in that performance tier. Okay, so really quickly, base tier funding. I think only 19 colleges are still getting base tier funding. It might even be fewer than that. But base tier funding is basically a calculation. It says instruction and operations and your local share. So the state says, okay, how much we think, based on the number of students you have, the number of contact hours that your students are enrolled in, how much we think it costs you to operate. Okay, so they've got a kind of general calculation for all of us. Then they say, okay, here's how much we're calculating that you collect from your local sources, tuition and fees, and your taxes. Okay, so if we take how much we think it costs you to operate, oh, that should be a minus sign, minus how much you collect from your local sources, then that's going to be the state-based tier funding to cover whatever that gap is. Okay, so if they're saying, okay, it costs you $2 million to operate based on how many students you have enrolled, you collect $1.5 million in taxes and tuition, then we're going to cover you $500,000. That is not a real set of numbers. That is just for me to be able to do very, very easy math. Okay, so again, fewer and fewer schools are getting the base tier funding. Again, it is capped at that 5% of total state appropriations. And then just also most institutions, based on their tuition and fees, based on their taxes, are able to cover their I&O costs. So where we spend the bulk of our time is on the performance tier, really making sure that we are outcomes-based. So we've got things like credentials of value. Those are going to be your certificates, your associate degrees. We've also got credentials of value that are in high demand fields, okay? So the state is going to give you a little bonus if it's in a field that they know is high demand, right? There are many jobs available. They're paying a living wage. Also, students who transfer with at least 15 semester credit hours to a four-year university, you're going to get funding for them, right? One of, again, the core tenets of community colleges is making sure that our students are prepared to transfer into that four-year institution to get that bachelor's degree. And then, of course, we've got the students in dual credit. If you have a student that completes 15 hours of dual credit, you get funding for them as well. We've also got some additional weight. So if a student is economically disadvantaged, academically disadvantaged, or considered an adult learner, 25 or older, then you will get an additional weight on top of that. Okay, so if I have one student that was a dual credit student who completed 15 semester credit hours, but they were also economically disadvantaged, I'm actually going to get to multiply them by 1.25. Adult learners are a 1.5. Okay, some of the methodology. So, again, focusing on our adult learners, community colleges, again, we are the economic drivers of our communities, so we want to make sure we're giving adult learners the opportunity to come back, skill up, and get that better job. So the state, again, has backed us up on that mission and making sure that if we have adult learners, they're going to get extra funding within the methodology. Dual credit. We did do some shifting with dual credit. Previously, dual credit students had counted once for dual credit and then once as a transfer to a four-year. That's been eliminated, okay? So it is just that dual credit. Now, if the student were to come to us and achieve another 15 hours and then transfer into their four-year institution, then great. We would count them twice, but it would probably be in 2 different years. Transfer. Some adjustments that the state made after the initial calculations came out was, okay, if a student took 15 hours at Jones College and then took 17 hours at Janes College and then transferred, only one of those institutions would get credit for that student when they transferred, okay? You're only going to give one institution the funding for that student. And it is going to be the college that the student received the majority of their contact or their credit hours at. So Janes College with 17 hours would be the winner in that formula, and they would get the funding for that student when they finally went on to that four-year institution. Outcomes forecasting. So there is a lot of forecasting. The state has put out many, many models. They are all online. And so I encourage you to ask your CFO and CEO to go look at those. You don't need to worry about it. But if you want to, it is all out there. It is highly detailed, highly nuanced, but you can even play around with it. And you can say, okay, if this year we had 270 completers in this associate's degree and 42 of them were academically disadvantaged, what does that calculate out to compared to what we got this year? And then data sources. The state has been refining what data sources are using as they're looking at all of these calculations, making sure that we're using the state data that we submit directly to CoBoard versus some of the other, when we were initially building out House Bill 8, they were using iPads for some things, CoBoard data for others. So we're making sure that's all streamlined. So again, as we as institutions are reporting to the state, that data is what is being used to calculate everything with regard to House Bill 8. Okay, so just to touch on credentials of value, and this is a sticky one. So credential of value, because all of our credentials are valuable, right? So whenever you have this term credential of value, it's like, well, then all of them. Well, credential of value for the purpose of performance funding has a very certain meaning, okay? So not every credential is necessarily going to count in the performance funding. Okay, for a credential of value to count, it means that the total amount that the student invests, so what they pay us to take these classes to get that credential, plus the opportunity cost. Okay, so if they would have gone straight into the workforce right after high school and been working for 2 years, what would they have made, right? Plus a base comparison wage. So then also, okay, what would they have made coming straight out of high school compared to what are they making now that they have this credential? We have to take all of that into account. Then if we feel like the projected cumulative earnings of that student after they get our credential is greater, it exceeds all of that initial investment by that student, then it is considered a credential of value, okay? So let's kind of work through what does that really mean. So what it means is if a student comes to Wharton County Junior College and they spend 3.5 years getting an associate's degree because they were working part-time and taking care of their kids and trying to take classes at the same time, they finally complete that credential and they go into the workforce. If they are not earning more than they would have straight out of high school, then is that a credential of value to that student? That's the question we have to ask ourselves. And this makes us ask it, right? We should have been asking it all along, and many of us were, but it is incumbent upon us to ask ourselves, is this student's journey at this school truly changing the economic mobility of their life? Are they truly getting out and making a living wage so that they can go and support their family? Or are they coming here and we're giving them a credential where we should have honestly, when they were admitted, just told them, just go get that job over there at Buc-ee's because you're gonna make more than when you get out with this credential. No, we cannot do that. We cannot. We cannot. That is not part of our mission. It is not. So this framework, I'll say from my vantage point, it's been great as I've been talking to my board members about how we need to relook at the institution, right? How we need to look at everything we're doing. Are we making sure that our students are on a pathway that is truly going to change the trajectory of their lives and the trajectory of their families' lives? Because if they're not, then we really need to think about what that means for us and for them. Okay, so some revisions that came out with this most recent legislative session with regard to credentials of value. Okay, that entire calculation is somewhat new. So really there was a return on investment calculation that was in the initial House bill, but for all credentials, it was set at 10 years. Okay, so by the time that student got out from us, 10 years later, if they were making more than they would have been and if they'd recovered their costs, then we were counting it good. Well, no, we revised that. So we're making sure that with associate's degrees, it's at 5 years, okay? 5 years post-graduation, have all of those things added up to making that student come out ahead of where they would have been if they would have just gone straight into the workforce after high school. We're making sure that credential of value methodology is also going to be looked at for our short-term credentials starting now. Okay, so we started with associate's degrees. We're going to move that now into certificates, our OSAs, ICLCs, all of these kind of shorter term, and saying, okay, again, what does the timeline need to be? Because we can't sit here and say, oh no, it'll pay off. You just got to wait it out 10 years, guys. You just got to wait 10 years, and then this degree will have totally been worth it. No. Our students don't have time for that. We don't have time for that. We need to be more nimble than that. So just looking at the performance tier inputs, just to kind of give you a rundown. So these are the state appropriations, the fundable rates for each of the performance metrics that we have. So you can see, you go down the line, you've got dual credit, transfer, you've got your different credentials. So ICLCs, OSAs, those are very short term, right? These are like 9, 14-hour credentials that are upskilling students, getting them a higher wage job. We've got our traditional certificates, associates, and then of course for some of our institutions that offer bachelor's degrees, they get credit for that. Again, we talked about earlier, high demand. So if that credential is also in a high demand field, so something like a STEM area, engineering, those kinds of things, then you're gonna get credit on top of that. We talked about the completion rates. So again, some additional funds if those students meet certain criteria, academically disadvantaged, economically disadvantaged, and adult learners. And then we've got some new fundable outcomes, Opportunity High School Diploma. I don't know how many schools in the state went with that. I think there was an initial test group of maybe like 10 or 15. And then we've got third-party credentials. Again, those kind of go up to those short-term OSAs, ICLCs. All right, I'm gonna switch over to talk about FAST.
Yeah, so FAST has been a, oh, sure.
How do you define academically disadvantaged and,
Sure.
and economically disadvantaged? Is it by student?
Yes, it is. So each student is looked at independently. So if a student is low socioeconomic status, they're going to hit that economically disadvantaged mark. Okay, so think like students in our dual credit programs. If they're free and reduced lunch, right, they're going to hit that low SES. Academically disadvantaged, so these are the students that when they come into college for Texas, we have a TSI exam that all students need to take upon entry. That tells us if they are considered college ready or not. So if they come in to the institution as not college ready, they're considered in that academically disadvantaged bucket. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, great question. Yes.
I thought from a data standpoint, economic disadvantage means Pell recipient.
Which is the same as looking at their, I mean, in essence, looks at that socioeconomic, how much is the parents able to pay in? And there's a certain threshold so it is really the FAFSA that tells us that for the most part. So it's the,
Right, but they have to have received the Pell Grant for them to count as economically disadvantaged.
they have to receive it or been eligible.
Been eligible.
Because someone may be eligible, but due to other types of aid, may not be able to receive that for being over awarded. So there's various, but it is that eligibility of the FAFSA.
Well, and flip side, if the student doesn't complete the FAFSA, then we don't have the
Okay.
data to mark them as that, right? But yeah, they didn't necessarily take the Pell Grant from us, but yeah.
Does that help? Okay, great. Any other questions around that? Good. I know we're going through it fast. This was probably when we first put it together, a 2-hour presentation, and so we had to tear it back. So we are trying to go through it quickly, but also answer your questions. Yes.
High demand field value, I mean, I'm just wondering, why is it the same for the academically disadvantaged, economically disadvantaged?
So it's
Is there a bump for those?
So it's a bump of the 0.25 or the 0.50, so it's a multiplier in addition. So like if you get an associate's degree, you get 3,500. If they are also economically disadvantaged, there's another 0.25 basis that is added, and then 0.50 basis for the other. So it's in addition to, if that makes sense. They call it a weighted formula, but the best way I can say is you're getting those extra dollars, and they are stackable when it relates to those things. Good? Okay. All right. So when we talk about FAST, it has been, how many of you have heard of FAST? I know it's been a big conversation, probably very popular. I know the ISDs have been really talking with the various colleges about this. Participation by an institution, though, is optional. So just so you know that not all 50 community colleges across the state are participating for lots of various reasons. But it does provide our economically disadvantaged students, and again, when we're looking at the high school level, we have been dependent on the ISDs to let us know really if a student was eligible. Those rules continue to evolve. They've gotten better. I think we're in year 3 now. 3 or 4. It all starts to run together after a while. So, and it has gotten better each time we've gone through the program. But students who qualified for free and reduced lunch at any time during the past 4 years of their high school are deemed eligible for FAST. And so when they're enrolling at the institution, all tuition and fees are waived for the student. And that does include textbooks. So really a student all in, if they're qualified for FAST, an institution cannot charge anything to that student. And when we're looking at that, it is based off of how many hours that the student is taking, and then again, we're looking at that free or reduced lunch criteria. So this is really the full definition of that based off of the code, and when we're looking at that. And I think they made a couple slight variation changes to that this year to also recognize some of the other programs in the definition of a high school student. I think some of you are more familiar with that particular definition, I think, was changed in the last legislative to tweak that out a little bit to make it clearer as to who the students could be, especially in some of the more nuanced programs that we have. But by statute, FAST program requires that students incur no cost as part of the dual credit coursework. So again, books, tuitions. It has continued to go up. So the FY25 rate was $56.87 per semester credit hour. And again, that is what we receive back from the state for students who qualify for the program. And then for FY26, which is the fiscal year that we're currently in, that rate has gone to 58.52 cents per semester credit hour. And again, when we talk about that, it really is to help our students get through their college career at a little to no impact, right, as less financial debt as possible. And again, it is a huge program and has been a huge benefit to the students that it serves. Again, just taking some information that TAC had shared with us, 1.46 million of semester credit hours of dual credit have been provided at no cost to students. 260,000 students with financial aid have been served, and close to $80 million in funding has been dispersed to institutions participating in FAST. So I definitely think it's been an overwhelming success for the program. There has been some operational challenges that we've really worked with the state on and the coordinating board, and I'll say again, every iteration has gotten better, right? And as we've worked through the process, it's gotten cleaner and smoother. So I really hope this year will be even smoother than the last, but it is a huge program for our ISDs, and I know our students are taking advantage of that. So any questions about FAST before? I know that was kind of the high level version, but I want to make sure we go through that quickly. Okay, so in the last objective that they asked us to talk about with the training is some of the opportunities, some of the challenges when we're talking about our finances and what that looks like. And so I think, again, just trying to kind of keep it at an elevated level when we're talking about the various challenges. When we talk about state appropriations, when we talk about the tax cycle, when we talk about budgeting, it is a very dynamic timeline, and not all of it lines up very well, right? I laugh about that because at any given time as the CFO, I'm operating 3 operating budgets at any given time, right? So we're in FY26 operating, we're closing out 25 with the Act for Now, and already looking at 27 based off of state appropriations and the tax rate. So you're really always kind of living in 3 different worlds. So when we're talking about the dynamic timeline of the state appropriations, it continues to be challenging. Not to any fault of the state, it's just our cycles and the way they line up. So they continue just to be a challenge for us to get our arms around and to make sure that they line out correctly. Because typically right now, we've been getting, as entities, I think this year it was in July, where we got our first, or maybe late June, we got our first run of the state appropriations file. So most of us are already knee deep, if not neck deep, in the budget cycle by June. And so a lot of us are using forecasted data. We're looking at internal mechanisms to determine what our state appropriations piece will be, as well as taxes and tuition and fees. So typically as board members, you're hearing from us typically in maybe May, June, maybe late July, if you're on a later cycle when we're talking about budgets. So when we don't get the file for state appropriations on the first run until June, just know that you may start to see some of those numbers when your CFO, when your finance teams are presenting to you. If the numbers are evolving, it's because a lot of that is based off of real-time data that we're receiving. And so it's one of those things that's not a complaint. It's just something to let you all know as you're seeing this information presented to you, why significant numbers may shift, right? Ours passed recently shifted about $10 million in the first iteration of the budget budget to the second iteration based off of truing up and what the new runs of the state appropriation said. So I mentioned that to you just to be cognizant of it, just to be aware, right, if you're seeing those changes, especially because our job is to have the budget sealed up, submitted to the state no later than August 31st, right? So when we're getting state appropriations in June and July for a, budget lock in August, again, it's very challenging. And then many of us don't set tax rates till October, right? So it's just an ever-changing cycle that we're trying to get all of those things to align at one time when you're looking at the budget. Going back to just the state appropriation cycle, again, we get the data sometime in June from the state for our state appropriations piece. In October, we get the first payment of 3. So we used to be on a 10 pay in the previous cycle that Amanda was sharing with you. Now we're on a 3 pay. So we get 50% of state appropriations during that first payment in October. We get the second payment in February, and we get the third payment in June. So it's 50% in October, and then 25 and 25 in the January months, in January and June. Okay, so when we get that payment, typically then in the February payment, we have what's called a dynamic shore up, right? So if we've actually overachieved, then this is one of the dynamic things that we didn't have in the previous model. In the previous model, when we were only looking at head counts, if you grew tremendously during that time or if something happened, you were basically on a 2-year window to catch up, right? It wasn't dynamic. It didn't, your funding didn't move. The wonderful part of this is that our February payment does allow you to receive that. So if you really outshot your forecasted outcomes, if you really hit those metrics, then you can actually receive additional funding in February in that fiscal year. Okay, so that's a great thing to have. It's also, again, going back to the budget piece, it can also sometimes be challenging because you're trying to forecast that, because if you don't actually budget it, then you can't spend it. Right? If you didn't put it in the budget, even if you received it in February, that you can't spend it. So again, typically would roll into reserves, just making sure that you're aware of that. Because again, as we're talking to constituents, this is always something we talk with faculty. They see those additional funds come in and don't understand why we're not actually allowed to allocate that in that fiscal year.
Well, and real quick, just so from the board's perspective, so, we were very fortunate. So this is showing last year, but it was the most recent that we could find that was nice and clean for us.
Yeah.
Okay, so, end of fiscal year 2024, right? We actually, at WCJC, we'd had more graduates at the end of that year than we had been projected to have by the state when they initially did our state appropriations, right? So yay, great. So then in February, they said, oh, you actually graduated more students than we projected you did, so here's some additional money. Well, this is great news, and we shared it with the campus community. As Chrissy was mentioning, people are like, hey, we shared it with our board, and our board was like, oh, hey, okay, so great. So we've got an extra $700,000 to spend. What are we going to spend it on? Okay. So let's just take a pause. So just from the board's perspective, remember, hopefully, we're all hoping, right? You're going to get that update in February when those runs come out. You're hoping that that's how this is going to run, and you're going to get that boost in that February payment. Just remember and do a lot of good to your CEO and CFO when you don't immediately ask to spend those monies, just knowing, okay, yes, we got that, but it's going to have to wait, right? Okay, so just understand that when they say, hey, we can't spend that, it's not them trying to bank money somewhere or put it away. It really is just, it's that dynamic adjustment. So just be aware of that.
I appreciate it. If I've had to explain that if I've had to explain that once, I've had to explain that, 20 times, because it's not something that we, in really any other field do we understand that, right? Corporate America, if you overdo that corporate spending, it's a great job, right? In our world, if it's not in our budget, it's not part of our budget authority, you have to wait till next year. You can budget it out of reserves, but it can't be utilized unless it was budgeted. So it is a give and take with understanding the forecasted model. And I will tell you, it has continued to be a challenge operationally. I am a huge fan of House Bill 8. It has done tremendous things for the colleges, and we're very fortunate to have a legislature that is standing behind that. From an operational lens, it is difficult to put your arms around at times when you're trying to forecast and look at all the outcomes and keep up with the data. So I only say that to tell you just to understand that it's challenging, it is evolving, and we are continuing to learn and adapt. So So again, as we talk about those objectives and just looking at the things, the February adjustment can only increase funding. You can't lose funding in that same fiscal year. Okay, so that's a good thing, right? So we're not going to take away funding from us in that February. If you don't, so in your case, you overachieved, but in the case of a college that underachieves, you wouldn't actually lose funding from the state in February. It would come in the October shore up. So many of us, I mentioned to you those June, July runs, many of us started to see that shoring up, for lack of a better word, in those June and July runs, where it's like, okay, this is what was forecasted, this is what you were anticipated, this is what you actually received. And so in October, those adjustments came off the run, and so colleges may have had a downshift. So colleges 2 years ago had an upshift and then downshift. So we're seeing an evolution. And again, as Amanda said, the coordinating board has really done a lot this last year to really tweak the data to try to fine tune the numbers to get us closer to that. But it is continuing to evolve. But just know that it would be in October where those adjustments are received, but you do know about it in advance of the fiscal year. So I just want to make that clear. So when they do shore you up in October, you are made aware, again, in that July run, basically, that your funding from one year to the other may go down. Again, it's published with the new rules. So I think the very first year, we were flying the airplane as we were building the rules. And so the rules have continued to evolve. And I think we're on third or fourth iteration of the methodology and the cycle. And not to get too far down in the weeds, we'll save all of that for an advanced class, because they continue to evolve. But just know that they are looking at different formulas, and as Amanda said, continuing to evolve not only the data source, but the methodology being applied to each outcome base to better project that and forecast that. So just making sure that you're aware. So again, those are really a lot of the challenges. Amanda, do you have any other challenges from a presidential lens that you'd like?
So I'll say, I think the dynamism of the formula is the largest challenge that we've experienced for sure, and I think many people that I've talked to across the state have experienced. So could you flip back to the timeline real quick? Yeah, so, and Christy had mentioned this earlier, so just in like a normal year, like no surprises, you're constantly, right, operating in all of these different years in terms of your budget, and you're constantly looking back and looking forward and in the now. But with this, so just to kind of go back to this, showing the timeline. Okay, so again, I had mentioned, so at the end of that year, if you improved, you were seeing it in February. So as Christy mentioned, at the end of that year, if you had underperformed, right, where they had projected you were going to be, that is going to come that following October, right? That following October, that's where that's going to get calculated in. Okay, so we're super grateful for that, right? Because what I would hate is if plus or minus was in that February bucket, because then you're like, oh, okay, so $200,000 is just gone from the budget, or $2 million is gone from the budget. That would be, like complete chaos. But for institutions, when we're closing out our reporting that year and then looking at what our actuals are in terms of actual numbers of completers, actual numbers of transfers, we have to just then know, okay, so we aren't going to see it in this appropriation. That appropriation's been set, but it is going to come around then that following fiscal year, and we're going to have to account for it then. So this even more so really impacts how we're looking at budgets and thinking about budgets. And so just know, when things change, when your CEO comes to you and says, hey, this budget has shifted, we have got these new numbers in, just be aware that it is just a really living and breathing funding model. I mean, that's just what it is.
Yeah.
And so it's not necessarily a matter of, well, you didn't plan enough ahead, or we didn't schedule enough finance subcommittee meetings to get this budget in place. No, it's just that some of these things are extremely dynamic, and you just have to be aware that as they're going to get the information, they're going to come to you with it. And it may not be with as much notice as we would all love, but it is what it is with the dynamic nature of the funding. I'll say really quickly, so full disclosure, we were the only institution, WCJC, we were the only institution that received transition funding in the state out of 50 colleges. So I was executive vice president at the time. That's where I said at the start of the presentation, So then you want to cause a type A oldest sibling person to go into a tailspin, tell them you're the only one in the state getting transition funding because y'all would have been below where you were last year if we didn't have this for you. So took a deep dive, went into every single data point that the state provided to us, went into every single spreadsheet, learned those rules. But as a result, then this year, we came out better, right? We ended up getting a dynamic adjustment up in February because we had overperformed where the state was projecting us. So when I say that, people kind of question me because, man, that transition funding time was it was hard, right? And I always talk about how much I love House Bill 8, and they're like, really? Because y'all got transition funding. And I'm like, right. And what did it do? It caused us to have hard conversations with the institution. It caused us to really talk about how we were serving our students. It caused us to really look at what we were doing and say, okay, so this is not going to work. And it's not working for our students, it's not working for us, we've got to change. And so we made those adjustments, we made those changes, and we're so fortunate that the state, again, the legislative session has come out with, approving those increases. As everybody was improving their outcomes, the state backed that up with funds. So we are extremely grateful for that. And I just want to say, this shakes things up, but it shakes it up in a good way. It makes you have those conversations that you need to have to make sure that you are truly serving your students, you're truly serving your community. And it can be a rocky road to get there, but sometimes, those are the conversations you have to get to being the type of successful institution that you want to be.
Yeah, good. That's good feedback. So, again, happy to entertain any questions that you have. I know we went through some of that. We've got about 10 minutes, I think, and if not, we have some other content we can share, but did want to at least take a pause and see if we have any questions regarding either the state appropriations piece or any other factor. No questions? We did such a good job. Either that or you're just eager to... so overwhelmed by all the information. Yes.
I'll throw one out. One, I like the finance world. I've got a degree in economics, so I'm okay. That's a good thing. One thing that I'm kind of watching closely is the mobility of the students. And when they aren't able to finish their academic path with us, then where do they go? My community, I don't know if it's like any others, is really heavily military. And every 3 years, you can guarantee 30% of your people be gone. So is there another community that has that type of demographic? And how can we make sure that those that they're here for a student today, they deploy to some place called Globe who can't continue it necessarily? And maybe they come back, maybe they don't.
Sure. Yeah.
And try to track them.
Yeah, so I can talk. So we've recently hired an inaugural Chief Veterans Officer at Lone Star, and that's one of the things that we are looking at. It's not only our veterans that we're serving, where they're transferring, what's causing them to stop out, what's causing them to continue. So we're really taking a deep dive in that, as well as trying to serve our veterans that are in our community that may already be very close to a degree or may already have a degree and just need help getting a leg up to get a job. So we're happy to talk offline if that's something of interest and connect. They're actually meeting tomorrow with a couple of the universities and colleges to compare some of the programs that do it really well in the state and across the country to look at that data. Because, sometimes that's what's interesting. I think we haven't seen quite as much of that with online. So a lot of them can change their synchronous or move to a different program. But it definitely still occurs with our veterans with stopping out. So, but it's also something that many of us are still trying to chase the data on. Chase may be a strong word, but it's chase the data. It's trying to keep up with the millions of Texans that we do have that have some form of credential but haven't finished. And then how do we motivate them? How do we encourage them to come back to finish? Even if it's just a certificate of value, because just kind of like the certificates of value, like why is that important? Because they may only need, 6 hours, 9 hours to get to that next pay band or cycle or living wage, right? So we're kind of looking at that from a twofold standpoint, but definitely part of the conversations that we're having because credentials of value, you alluded alluded to it. A very sensitive topic, especially some of the programs that got eliminated from that program.
Right.
I agree, 100% worthwhile and headed in the right direction, but it's not without its flaws with certain programs. And I think that it only reports businesses that are 50 or more. So some
Yeah.
of your smaller occupations are getting left out of that.
Right.
So I just want to point out too that I think it's understood, but we may not have inferred it. So I think it's important to say just because someone's not a credential of value doesn't mean that it should be sunsetted. Right? I mean, there's a lot of program. I know cosmetology is one that we've talked about before. My husband and I joke about this. There's a big difference between what he pays to get his hair done and what I pay to get my hair done. And that we'll just leave it at that. But, cosmetology is not a credential of value. So it's one that we've argued, like, is it helpful to benefit? Well, but it's one that doesn't show up because most barbershops or places where you get your hair done doesn't have 50 people. So they're not showing up in that data. Therefore, that one's not coming across as a credential of value. But many of us have wait lists for those programs because they're a program that people can see upward mobility. So I just simply say that when you hear about programs not being a COV, it doesn't mean that it's not a worthwhile program. It doesn't mean that it's not a program that leads to a higher credential down the way. And again, as we're modifying that, I just want to keep that in mind because again, I know oftentimes programs come to you all to be either created or sunsetted. So that's just an important factor. And that's data that's going to change, I believe, every 2 years. Every year now in the last legislative audit, it can be changed. So just because it's not this year doesn't mean it's not next year. And if there is a specific regional occupation that is very important to your area and it's not showing up, that's where I feel like as board of trustees, as members of the various constituents, we have to encourage employers to pay more for those occupations and try to get several of those key areas up so that it does show up in that factor. So.
Yeah, and then something that touches on credential of value, but then also what you're talking about here with veterans, any population, community college students in general, we need to talk about timely completion. We need to figure out avenues and pathways for these students to complete in a timely fashion. So an associate's degree, even if a student is part-time, we need to figure out ways that it is not taking them 3 or 4 years to get through with a 2-year degree. Even part-time, that should not be an excuse. It is not an excuse for us to sit there and go, well, they're part-time. Well, yes. Because they've got a life, okay? So we need to address that. So talking about timely completion at your institution, ask your institutions, what pathways are you building for students who are veteran or who are military, who are part-time students? What avenues are you creating for them to get through these credentials in a timely manner? And that'll also help with credential of value. So when we were talking about credential of value, one of the key pieces to figuring out that calculation is how long it takes a student to get through the degree in the first place, right? So if a student can get through in a semester, right, their opportunity cost is very low because they only were out of the workforce for that one semester. So you have a higher likelihood of getting that credential of value on that COV list if you are getting these students through their credentials in a timely fashion. So have those discussions. Almost all of the institutions in the state are part of the Texas Association of Community Colleges TSC Pathways program, right? We go to these Pathways Institutes. We talk about this all the time. So have those conversations. If you're not getting reports from Pathways Institutes, just ask about it, inquire about it. They can spend a report at a board meeting just kind of going over some of the cool and innovative ways they're trying to get students on that path and make sure they're progressing in a timely fashion so that all of these students can complete quickly. We need to get them in the workforce quick.
Well, thank you. I think that we are right at time. 2 minutes. We have 2 minutes. So unless someone has any burning last-minute question, we don't want to stand between you and your next activity.
One of the problems that we have we're on the border is there's a multitude of custom brokers that are requesting foreign trade exemption.
Yeah.
So they don't pay taxes.
Non-objection letters.
Right.
Yeah, we've seen an uptick. We have seen an uptick of that as well with all the, I guess you're talking about like the non-objection letters for taxes. Yeah. And, sorry.
The thing about it, and especially based on what you're saying, the thing about it that we're the number one, we're the largest import in the nation. So there's warehouses galore. So
Yeah.
they continue coming to us, and I was
Yeah.
asking that question. Is there a cap of the amount that we could approve? annually or something?
Not to my knowledge. This question has come up with our board as well because, and so if you're not familiar, those of us who may have taxing districts that are in port areas can submit, or companies can submit to us what we call non-objection letters, which means that we're held harmless. We still actually receive in dollar figures what we would have received in taxes in lieu of. So like as an institution, someone comes and says, we're going to build this warehouse. Here's the port. Here's all of our here's our information for this pilot program. Please do it. We would still receive our dollars, but it does help them from an economic standpoint with tariffs and those sort of things. I think in the recent years, we may have seen one or two. Last year, though, so this was in previous years, one or two. I think we've received 6 this year. So we've had a lot of.
Every board meeting we get leads.
Yeah, so it's also come up with us too, because to my knowledge, there's not necessarily a cap. I mean, at any time, what we're looking at is what is the financial viability? What is the impact? Is it a true impact benefit? But it's one of those things that we are also talking about too, because again, we're held harmless. Those are dollars we're still receiving, but it is something that we are being asked a lot of questions about as well, just to make sure that we, so I'm researching some of those things now.
There's never been talks about maybe having a cap limit.
Not to my knowledge. That doesn't mean that, again, this has just been an initial conversation with ours as well, just because in past years we would maybe see 1, maybe see 2. We'd only see a handful, but with the uptick in tariffs, and it is a very long application process, so you could start to see more. And again, I don't know if others see that, but I know that is something we're looking into as well. So, okay, all right. Well, thank you all. Thanks for joining us.